Lionel Richie canceled his concert in Chicago tonight at the United Center after an onstage health scare during Wednesday night's show in Minnesota.
Now we're hearing from fans who are worried about the Grammy winner's health.
To understand why this moment hit so hard, it helps to remember just how much there are moments in a legend's career that nobody sees coming. And for Lionel Richie, that moment arrived on a stage in Minnesota in front of 10,000 people who had shown up expecting nothing but a party. What they got instead was a scare that would follow the 77-year-old singer through the opening weeks of his summer tour, spark a wave of concern across the music world, and force fans to reckon with a question none of them wanted to ask out loud. Is Lionel Richie's body finally telling him it's time to slow down? The story that unfolded afterward is more layered than a single headline can capture, and by the time you understand the full picture, you may find that the panic and the reality tell two very different tales. Weight Lionel Richie carries as a cultural figure. Born in 1949 in Tuskegee, Alabama, he grew up in a household where music wasn't a hobby, it was a family language. His grandmother taught classical piano. His uncle played jazz for a living, and the campus of the historic Tuskegee Institute surrounded him with a kind of musical seriousness that most children never experience. He arrived at college on a tennis scholarship and once imagined a life in the ministry, but a school band called the Commodores pulled him toward the microphone instead, and the rest is one of the great stories in American pop music. What began as Richie playing saxophone in the background of funk groups slowly turned into something else entirely, as the band leaned on his voice and his songwriting more and more until he became the face audiences associated with the sound. The Commodores gave the world Brick House, Easy, and 3 Times a Lady, records that carried the band from regional clubs into arenas across 2 continents. But it was Richie's decision to step out on his own in the early 80s that turned him into a household name on a completely different scale. His 1983 album, Can't Slow Down, became one of the defining records of the decade, moving more than 20 million copies and producing kind of songs that still show up at weddings, graduations, and long car rides for decades later. All Night Long, Hello, and Endless Love didn't just top charts. They helped define what a crossover pop ballad could sound like, blending R&B roots with a polish that made Richie just as comfortable on adult contemporary radio as he was on soul stations. Beyond the hits, Richie's fingerprints are all over some of music's most significant charitable moments. He co-wrote We Are the World alongside Michael Jackson, a song that raised tens of millions of dollars for famine relief and brought together an extraordinary lineup of artists for a single overnight recording session, one Richie has repeatedly named as one of the proudest achievements of his life, separate from any chart position or paycheck. His songwriting has also quietly funded other careers, including hits he wrote for country legend Kenny Rogers, records that continue to generate royalties decades later. All of that, combined with his decades on television, has built him a fortune most entertainment outlets estimated around $200 million heading into 2026, a number padded further by his role as a judge on American Idol, a job reported to pay him close to $10 million a year. That combination of financial comfort and cultural staying power meant Richie had every reason to expect his newly launched tour with Earth, Wind and Fire, will be nothing more than another triumphant lap around the country. The pairing made sense on paper. 2 acts synonymous with feel-good soul and funk, both still capable of selling out arenas decades after their commercial peak. Announced back in January, the run was mapped out as a 26-date trek stretching from Minnesota all the way to Texas, with stops in major markets like New York, Atlanta, and Los Angeles along the way. Demand ran high enough in several cities that extra seating was added in the weeks before the tour began, and Richie himself posted a message thanking his band and crew for preparation, giving no hint that anything out of the ordinary was on the horizon. Then came opening night. On June 24th, 2026, Richie and Earth, Wind and Fire kicked off to sing a song all night long. Tour at the Grand Casino Arena in St. Paul, Minnesota, in front of a packed house of roughly 10,000 fans. For the better part of an hour, the show unfolded exactly as anyone would expect from 2 acts with as much combined stage experience. Earth, Wind and Fire opened with a tight, crowd-pleasing set, and Richie took over from there, working through a catalog of songs that fans have heard him perform hundreds of times over the decades. About 55 minutes into his set, something changed. Richie was midway through Dancing on the Ceiling, a song built entirely around movement, one that typically has him bouncing across the stage and working the crowd into a frenzy. Instead, He lowered himself onto a platform and stayed there, telling the audience he was feeling dizzy and strange. In a moment that instantly became the most talked-about clip of the night, he joked with the crowd about the situation before deciding to play it safe rather than push through. He then moved to a piano bench to perform 3 times a lady seated, something longtime fans immediately clocked as unusual, since that ballad is normally delivered standing at center stage with Richie fully in command of the room. What followed was an uncomfortable stretch of uncertainty for everyone in the building. Richie announced what he called a surprise intermission and exited through a large screen bearing his name, and his band members lingered on stage for roughly 15 minutes before quietly leaving as well. Fans in the arena described a strange tension settling over the crowd during that gap, unsure whether they were watching a planned bit or something genuinely going wrong. Roughly 40 minutes after Richie first left the stage, his saxophonist stepped up to the microphone and delivered the news nobody wanted to hear. Lionel wasn't feeling well, and the show would not continue that night. Paramedics met Richie backstage, and according to reports that circulated in the hours after the concert, he was transported to a local hospital by ambulance. A public information officer with the St. Paul Fire Department later confirmed that a patient had indeed been taken from the arena to a hospital that night, lending an official layer of confirmation to what fans had already pieced together from concert footage. Sources close to the situation described the trip as a precautionary step rather than confirmation of anything serious. But in the immediate aftermath, with no official statement from Richie's camp, that distinction did little to calm nerves online. The most concrete explanation to surface in the first days after the show came secondhand, from Earth, Wind and Fire drummer John Paris, who told a Minnesota newspaper that Richie had simply been a little dehydrated. It was a relatively mundane explanation for a moment that had looked alarming in the moment, but it also was an official diagnosis delivered by Richie's own team or a treating physician, which left plenty of room for fans to keep speculating in the days that followed. Adding to the surreal quality of it all, footage from Richie's own performance just weeks earlier in an amphitheater opening in Michigan showed him looking as energetic as ever, which made the sudden dip in stamina in Minnesota feel especially jarring to anyone who had followed the tour build-up closely. This wasn't the first time Richie's health has intersected with his career in dramatic fashion. Back in the 1990s, at what was arguably the peak of his commercial fame, he developed a mysterious problem with his vocal cords serious enough to require 4 separate surgeries while doctors tried to pin down the cause. That saga stretched on for an uncomfortably long time before physicians eventually traced the issue back to diet-related acid reflux, a diagnosis that allowed him to fully recover and avoid a repeat of the problem for the rest of his career. Richie has said in past interviews that during those years, he genuinely feared his singing career might be over, a fear that has apparently stuck with him enough to make him unusually disciplined about vocal rest and hydration on tour compared to many peers from his era. More recently, in a memoir released in 2025, Richie opened up for the first time about being diagnosed with ADHD, describing a restless childhood defined by what he called layers of sensory overload, struggles that simply didn't have a clinical name or any real support system back when he was growing up in Alabama. That disclosure caught a lot of longtime fans off guard, since a version of Richie the public has always seen leans heavily on charm, polish, and total control of a room. None of these older health chapters are believed to connect directly to the dizziness he experienced in St. Paul, but together they paint a picture of a performer who has quietly managed more behind-the-scenes challenges than his effortless public image would suggest. The fallout from that opening night arrived fast. Live Nation announced that Richie's next 2 scheduled stops, in Chicago and in Columbus, Ohio, would be postponed entirely on doctor's orders, so he could rest and return full health before getting back on stage. The official statement described Richie as heartbroken about the cancellations and promised the tour would pick back up just a few days later in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. That relatively short turnaround, only a handful of days between the postponed shows and the planned return, suggested from the start that his medical team was treating this as a short-term setback rather than something that required an extended break, even though no specific recovery benchmarks were ever spelled out publicly. As of that point, no rescheduled dates have been announced for the missed shows in Chicago or Columbus, leaving ticket holders in both cities waiting on updates while the rest of the tour marched forward as planned. Naturally, the episode reignited a broader conversation that has been simmering around the touring industry for years now. What does it actually take for performers in their late 70s to keep meeting the physical demands of arena-scale shows, night after night, city after city? Richie has spent much of his later career building an identity around exactly that kind of stamina, positioning himself as a legacy act who simply doesn't slow down the way some of his peers have. Several artists from his generation have already scaled back their touring schedules in recent years, citing the exact kind of physical toll that comes with the style show, which made Richie's commitment to a full 26-date run feel notable even before anything went wrong, and made his health scare all the more closely watched by an industry curious whether that pace is still sustainable for performers his age. For a few days, the story sat in that uncomfortable in-between space, an artist hospitalized, 2 shows scrapped, a vague explanation floating around secondhand, and a tour that was technically still moving forward without any confirmation from Richie himself about how he was actually doing. Fans swapped clips of the moment online, many expressing relief that he still seemed to be in good spirits, even while visibly struggling, alongside plenty concern about what might come next. It's exactly the kind of gap between silence and speculation that tends to make a story feel far scarier than it may ultimately turn out to be. And that's precisely what happened here, because in the days that followed, the picture started to clear up, and the update was a genuinely good one. On June 30th, right on schedule, Richie returned to the stage at PPG Paints Arena in Pittsburgh, resuming the tour alongside Earth, Wind and Fire exactly as his team had promised. Fan-captured footage from that show showed him looking energetic and clearly back in his element, even joking from the stage that he could do a commercial for an electrolyte drink after everything he'd been through. It was the first real, visible confirmation that whatever had happened in Minnesota wasn't going to keep him off the road for long. Just before that Pittsburgh comeback, Richie's ex-wife Brenda Harvey Richie posted an update of her own on social media, thanking fans for their concern and letting everyone know he was okay and would be back on stage. From there, the tour rolled forward without further interruption. Richie and Earth, Wind and Fire played Detroit the following night, then crossed into Canada for shows in Toronto and Montreal over the holiday weekend, hitting every date on the calendar without another postponement. On July 4th, performing at Scotiabank Arena in Toronto, Richie addresses fans directly on Instagram, thanking them for every kind word they'd sent his way and telling them plainly that he was doing well and grateful for all of them, while praising the energy he'd felt from the crowd since his return. So, where does that leave the version of this story suggested by a headline warning that things are looking bad for Lionel Richie? The honest answer is that the scariest chapter of this story was also the shortest one. What played out in St. Paul was genuinely alarming in the moment. A beloved 77-year-old icon sitting down mid-performance, being rushed to a hospital, and leaving fans without clear answers for days. But rather than marking the start of some longer decline, it appears to have been exactly what his team suggested from the beginning, a short-term physical setback, likely tied to dehydration, that a few days of rest was enough to resolve. He didn't cancel the rest of the summer. He didn't scale back his commitments. And by every account since Pittsburgh, he has looked like the same high-energy performer fans have followed for decades. That doesn't mean the moment carries no weight going forward. Richie is still touring through cities like Boston, New York, and Los Angeles before the run wraps in Austin on August 14th. And beyond that, he already has additional dates lined up overseas, including a show at Sandringham Estate in England in August, along with more stops later in the year. Every performer in his late 70s who commits to a schedule this demanding is, in some sense, testing the limits of what a body built for the stage can still handle decade after decade. The St. Paul scare is a reminder that those limits are real, even for someone with Richie's remarkable track record of reliability, someone who kept performing through his 60s and 70s with barely a hiccup, and was held down a demanding weekly television gig on American Idol since 2018 without significant interruption. But reminders aren't the same thing as verdicts. What actually happened here is a story about a scare, a quick and transparent response from Richie's team, a short pause, and a return to form that fans ought to see with their own eyes within a week. It's a far cry from the kind of career-ending crisis that a sensational headline might imply, and it says something meaningful about Richie himself that his response to a health scare in front of 10,000 people was to crack a joke about hydration, thank his fans by name for their support, and get right back to doing the thing he's built his entire life around. There's also something worth sitting with in how differently this story reads depending on which day you're catching it. In the immediate hours after the St. Paul concert, The coverage leaned hard into uncertainty and worry, and understandably so, since nobody outside Richie's inner circle had any real information to go on. A week later, once he was back on stage joking with crowds in Pittsburgh and thanking fans personally